We're starting a new video series today. We're going to be LS swapping this 1972 Dodge Challenger. This is actually going to be a temporary swap. It's going to be completely reversible, so I don't want to make any kind of permanent changes to this car that will prevent me from swapping it back to its original engine. This is a 1969 383 big block Mopar. I recently rebuilt this engine completely and then installed it in the car, paired it with the TR60 6-speed manual transmission. But now we're going to be taking this engine out of this car and dropping it into a 1969 Super B. In the meantime, we're going to be playing around with this car a little bit, so why not do an LS swap in the process before we end up switching it back to a regular Mopar. As you can see, this car is far from stock. It has a serpentine belt drive conversion kit by CVF. It has a Holly Street Dominator single plane intake, factory replacement aluminum cylinder heads, engine 7/8 long tube headers, PRW double roller timing chain, PRW SFI balancer, Proform 750 CFM mechanical secondary carburetor, Holley VR series regulator, and Sniper fuel system front to back. And to top it all off, we have a Daytona Sensors CD1 ignition system. So while I've been talking, I've had the coolant system draining, so I've got that out of here. We're going to get rid of the radiator, the front end components, and maybe even the fenders, because we're going to be cutting some of this out. And after that, we're going to be pulling the hood as well. Just finished removing the fenders and all of the cooling system up here in the front. I think I'm going to remove the belt drive next. I don't think it's necessary. I think we can go ahead and pull the engine up and out just the way it is, but it is kind of an expensive system and I would feel really bad if I end up damaging it, so I'd much rather not do that. Next up here is to actually disconnect the starter. I've already disconnected the battery. I've got to disconnect the alternator. The battery is actually in the back, so any wires leading up to the back where the battery is, those are going to have to get disconnected and then set off to the side before we pull the engine out, or I'm going to be fighting those wires, and one way or another I'm going to end up cutting them. So before it comes to that, I want to go ahead and disconnect those, run them through the back of the intake, and then out of here. I also need to disconnect my power steering lines and the coupler here, and I'm probably going to just shove the double D shaft right back into the I did it column, and then just take the coupler and then set it off to the side. That way I don't have to remove the headers. I don't have any exhaust from the collector back, so I should be able to just tilt the engine a little bit and then yank it out, or at least I'm hoping that I can do that. On the other side, it's kind of a similar situation, but the header is a little bit closer to the torsion bar, so I'm hoping that I can kind of wiggle the engine and then pull it out of there. But if push comes to shove, I can pull the engine up and then disconnect the header, and then either leave the header just kind of dangling there, or try to just loosen it up to a point where I can twist it so I can get the motor out of there. I think I'm about ready to pluck the engine out. I've got all the power steering disassembled. I've got the ground connections that were on it and disconnected those. All the power cables to the starter, and the starter's just kind of floating there. All the fuel lines are disconnected. I've already taken off all the bolts for the bell housing. I think that pretty much covers everything. I don't have an oil cooler or anything like that, so I don't have any kind of hoses. I don't have any automatic transmission lines, so I don't have to worry about those either. I've already done the motor mounts. Those are all good to go. I left the tie bar that goes in between these two. I left that one on. I might have to drop it actually, but hopefully once I raise the engine up, I'll be able to hold the transmission up with the jack, and then I'll be able to pry those two apart and then yank it forward, up, and out. I did a similar thing with my 73 Charger, and I didn't have to take off the little link. The only difference between that one and this one is that one was turbocharged, so it had the headers that go up and over, and then this one has long tube headers that go down. So little things like that will kind of change the way that you go about taking this apart, but the only thing left to do now is to just attempt to take it off. So hopefully all goes well and I'll be able to pull this engine out of here in the next half hour or so. One last thing I haven't considered was the possibility of having to remove the hood. Last time on my Charger, I just undid the first bolts and then loosened up the second bolts, and then as the engine was climbing up, I could just push the hood up against the hinges and it kind of just flapped up, got the engine out of there, and then it all came down. All right, so the engine is finally out. We have it here on the ground. As you can see, it's all bare bones now. I haven't seen this car like this probably since middle of last year, when Barry from No Bolts Left Behind helped me install this engine in here in the first place. The next step for us is to actually start the mock-up of the LS. We're going to see just how well the LS fits inside this engine bay, so let's go ahead and jump on that. This is the new Speedway Motors mock-up block. So we have an LS mock-up block in here, and we've also got a set of cylinder heads right up here. Unlike the older composite blocks, these blocks are actually made out of laser cut steel, and it's more like a big puzzle where you just have to put all the pieces together, and by the time you're all done, you're left with the one-to-one mock-up block. The main benefit for this is that the block is significantly lighter, which means you can pick it up with one hand and drop it into the engine bay without any kind of special tools or machinery. Assembly was overall pretty easy. As long as you follow the instructions, you shouldn't get lost. I did end up trying to jump a couple of steps a few times, but it never really quite worked out. It's nice that you can order the heads and the block separately in case you want to save a little bit of money, but the real cool part is that you can actually run your factory 100% OEM heads on their blocks. Personally, I like the sheet metal because it's lighter and easier to handle, but you can really do whatever you want. So here it is all assembled. It actually looks fairly close to an LS. It's got a couple holes here that you could use for the water pump, I believe, and then it's got a couple other holes here, I believe, for accessories as well. It did come with a bunch of extra nuts, so if you have the hardware to install the water pump, you just grab some of these nuts and then stick them on the back part, and you should be good to go. It also comes with provisions for the exhaust, so you would just run your exhaust bolts through here and then grab a couple nuts. Same thing, put them in the back, and you should be good to go. Same thing goes for the valve covers, intake manifold, and in fact for the intake manifold you have two different patterns to choose from depending on what intake you're going to run. On the back side, as you can see, I've already bolted on a T56 bell housing, but it also comes with a couple of provisions in case you want to run something that's not LS specific. You've got a couple of holes here so you can run the bolts in. I don't have the appropriate transmission bolts, so I just grabbed whatever I could from the pile, but as long as they fit the LS thread pitch, I just grabbed a few nuts, threw them on the backside, and now we're ready to rock. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bolt the mock-up engine to the transmission, and then we're going to see if we can get it to drop inside the car. I've got the transmission sitting on its butt right now, but as you can see, Speedway actually left a nice big pocket for the input shaft to poke through on your transmissions. So even if you have a manual transmission, you don't have to make your own hole. The hole is already set up here in the factory, so that's one less thing I have to do myself. Now that this is all done, it's time to start the real mock-up process. So I've got the mock-up block inside of the engine bay, and I've actually installed the radiator as well, just to give myself a general idea of how much room I'm going to have. But honestly, it's over a foot of room between this back of the radiator and the front of the engine. If you add in, let's say, 6 inches of accessory drive, it still only ends up here, and I'm still going to have a ton of space. So I'm really excited. The transmission that I'm using is already compatible with both the big block as well as the LS. So I bolted the transmission exactly where it was before, and this is the placement that it gave me. I didn't have to move anything else. The engine is actually sitting pretty far back, so that's really, really good, especially in the handling department. The next step for me now is to actually build the engine mounts, and I'm going to need to build some brackets, and then I'm going to try to use some stock style or stock replacement mounts. I've raised the car pretty high up right now, but I've given myself about 2 3/4 of an inch or so between the face of the factory engine mount placement and the face of where the motor mount's going to go. So that gives me a maximum build height of about 2 3/4 of an inch. As for the rubber part of the mounts, let me show you what I'm thinking about using. To remedy the motor mount situation, this is kind of what I came up with. I've got the stock big block motor mount right here, and right next to it I've got a factory LS motor mount. So this one's for a 6.3 liter, this is for a 5.3 liter. This is probably the reason why these motor mounts last a heck of a lot longer than these ones do. So if you guys remember, I mentioned that we need a total height of about 2 3/4 of an inch. So if we measure from the back side of this mount to the top face, we're at about 1.5 inches. So if we take 1.5 inches, that still leaves us with 1.25 inches left over. So what I'm thinking is that I could actually cut this guy all the way across. This measures about 1 inch. And so doing that will give me about 1/4 inch of space left between this, and that's where this plate comes in. So there's about 1/4 inch thick plate. I drilled 2 holes for it, one's for the index mark, one's for the bolt hole, and this will just go on like that. If you add 1/4 inch to 1.5 inches, that's 1 3/4 plus 1 inch, that's 2 3/4 of an inch, which is exactly what we need to take up the space. If we need to go higher on the engine, I can just make plates or spacers that can go in between this plate and this motor mount, weld them to this plate, and then I can raise this 1/4 inch at a time, or 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch, or whatever I need until I get the right height. So if I go and cut this, this is what I end up with. As you can see, we've got the 2 little 1 inch legs here. And if I take this engine mount with the plate, this would end up being something like that. The only thing that's missing is figuring out the angle that the engine mounts are located in the big block car, and then compare that to the pads on the block and figure out what that is, because I don't think that we're going to be able to just put this right up against this and then weld it across. I don't think that's going to work. I feel like it's going to want maybe a little bit open on one side or the other side. So to figure that out, after we set the engine in place, we're going to weld the top corners and then figure out how much gap is left. So in order to figure that out, we're going to have to drop the engine back into its place. So let's go ahead and do that. Also notice that I painted the engine bay. What do you guys think? On the mock-up block, you have actually two sets of holes here. You have these back ones and you have these front ones. I double checked with the 4.8 block that I have on the ground that the ones that we're going to be using are these four. What these ones would be used for, I'm not quite sure. They could be used for, let's say, a different type of car, different type of engine mount. But the way that I figured out which one I was going to use was that I looked at the 4.8 and I figured an imaginary line in between the middle cylinders, and then where the engine mount pads were, that's where I lined these ones up. So if you're swapping in a 4.8, 5.3, 6 liter, just make sure that you're using the front bolts to mock it up and not the back ones. I've got the engine set down in the engine bay right now, and I've already made sure that the engine is level left to right. I've got my angle finder right here and it says 0 degrees, maybe 1 degree. And if I move my angle finder over to the level, we can see that it is also set to 0. So left to right, the engine should be as even as you can possibly get it. You shouldn't really have to have it twisted one way or another. So left to right, it's fine. Front to back, however, it's a different story. So normally you want the engine to have about a 3-degree tilt, so that way when you install the drive shaft, it's not set up at such an extreme angle. The lower you get that tail shaft, the flatter that drive shaft's gonna get. So ideally, the amount that the engine is tilted back should actually match the pinion angle on your rear diff. That way the two angles cancel out and you don't have any kind of vibrations. I have the big block mounts where they're supposed to go. I have a 7.5-inch plate going all the way to the back of the engine mount, and I did make sure that both plates end up at the exact same length. And since I know both of these engine mounts are set up evenly, the length of the plate will decide how far the engine is going to be set back. And judging by this, I could go another 1/2 inch or inch or so and still be in the safe zone. But I do have accessories and things that are going to be right here, and then that'll cause me to have to clearance the block or whatever. So I definitely don't want to do that. I want to make sure that if I ever have to replace the engine mounts, these are blown out, but if I ever have to replace the new engine mounts, I want to make sure that I want to be able to go to any auto parts store, buy a set of the appropriate stock mounts for this car, and then get those ones, install those, and then be on my way. When you're building something custom, you want to make sure you use as many OEM parts as possible. That way, when you go to the auto parts store, they're almost always going to have what you need in stock, or they could order it pretty much the next day. Versus something that's special order that may take 2, 3, 4 days, maybe even a week to get here. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, you don't really have a week to spend. So that's my idea with going with factory mounts for the 72 Challenger. At this point, I've already verified the 3-degree tilt. Left to right, the engine is even. The LS engine mounts meet somewhat close to where the Mopar mounts are. So the LS mounts sit a little bit higher up, but not a big deal. I'll be able to gusset that, add some support, and that shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. So I'm going to go ahead and tack weld these mounts at the highest point here and there on both sides. That way I'll be able to transfer these mounts onto the real engine to verify that I don't have any clearance issues before I continue on with whatever I'm going to do. So let me go ahead and do that first. So I just found a little issue with my motor mount design. I don't have any access to this bolt except with the wrench. So now I'm going to have to make myself an access down here, so that way I'm able to run a bolt through here without having to try to fiddle with the wrench later on. Lucky I'll be able to spin this off with 2 wrenches at the same time and get this thing out of here. I couldn't find anyone else on YouTube doing the same swap, so figuring things like this is all part of the process. I test fit the mounts on an old iron block LS that I have here in the corner of the garage, just to make sure that the mounts that I made on the mock-up block are going to fit the same way on the real thing. So I got the driver's side mount. Actually, there's a passenger side. Driver's side mount, they're directional now. So we got the 4 bolts right there. We got those holes lining up right there. And there's actually a little bit of interference right behind this guy. And it's actually this little nub right here. So instead of shaving it off the block, I shaved it off the mount itself. And then on the opposite side, we had a similar situation. There's no nub here, but I'll show you what is in the way. So same thing, we got our bolt holes lined up, and then behind this mount, you can't really see it, but I'll show you now. We've got this nub right here for the AC compressor, and that fits in this hole that I notched out for the mount right there. And although it looks like I cut out a decent amount, the little nub doesn't even hit the motor mount at all, except for like one tiny little corner, which I'm not too concerned about at all. So considering those two things, I think the mounts are gonna work perfectly fine on the real thing. And here are the engine mounts fully assembled on the car. As you can see, they line up perfectly to where the stock motor mounts fit, because after all, they are stock motor mounts. Then we have the motor mount adapter plates right there on top. I still have to go in and drill a hole, add a sleeve, then add another bolt, and then be able to use all 4 bolts to bolt it down. The transmission lines up fine, and we can move on to the next step, which is going to be the oil pan. That's something we're going to tackle in the following video. There's a lot to talk about on the oil pan, so we are going to save that for the following video. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next episode. Night Wrencher, signing out.